Hey folks, this is Kelani. With Blizzard trying to open up their doors for a little bit more communication about certain design choices and lack of explanations related to several Battle for Azeroth systems, it looks like they might have opened up a bit of a hornet's nest when it comes to the Azerite Armor system. From stonewalling feedback throughout the beta to band-aid fixes which barely even try to cover the gaping wounds, it doesn't seem like we're all on the same page. The Azerite Armor system was supposed to replace the artifact weapon system from Legion and provide us with a decent form of character progression with a few exciting new bits and bobs to try and make us forget about losing our beloved artifact weapons. But I think there's too many small flaws with the system which all add up to some pretty massive cracks that most players just can't help but take notice of. I guess it really doesn't help when the only communication we get from Blizzard devs about the system is that it's more or less working as intended and we're not seeing the bigger picture. We know there are some changes coming to the Azerite system and also potentially to the amount of Azerite gear that we'll be able to collect each week, but will that be enough? Will any amount of changes be enough at this point? Let's have a look at what the Azerite Armor system was supposed to be, the glaring issues that it has right now, and what could be done to remedy them. Let's start with the dream. What was the Azerite Armor system supposed to look like? What was the perfect, ideal situation for Azerite Armor going into Battle for Azeroth? From what we've heard recently, it seems like the dev team wanted Azerite Armor to be another set of mini talents which we would chop and change between for varying situations like single target, AoE, raids, dungeons, and whatever else happened to crop up in between. To manage all of those traits, we would be running around with several sets of gear for each spec, so we always had the option to swap things around if we felt like it. The different traits should change your gameplay or playstyle just a little bit to help take advantage of interesting perks or bonuses, sort of like raid sets in previous expansions. You can stack up to 3 of each trait if you really wanted to and create any number of combinations to your heart's content. That's all fine and dandy. This vision might have worked if it weren't for the myriad of issues plaguing the system. One of the largest issues simply comes down to the traits and balancing. Too many traits are either just really boring and don't change anything with your gameplay, or numerically insignificant. Sometimes they're both. For a lot of classes, many traits are just subpar. That left plenty of players just automatically taking the general traits for most of their Azerite pieces and calling it a day. That was their best setup for the armor pieces across the board. That meant the highest item level piece of gear, with the best general traits, would be their largest upgrade. That might be one of the best positions to be in when it comes to actually getting an upgrade for your Azerite Armor, but it's also one of the most boring. On the other side of the fence, we have classes who have 1 or 2 absolutely overpowered traits to the point where item level upgrades actually aren't upgrades. That's another problem in and of itself, but all in all, among all of the traits that are available to every class, chances are you're only ever interested in a handful. If those traits are boring, you don't really get any excitement out of the entire system. If those traits are rare, you're probably going to be more frustrated than anything else while trying to hunt down very specific pieces. I know there are plans to switch things up with the Azerite traits, nerf the ones head and tails above the others, and try to bring a few other lackluster traits up a notch or two. So far there's been a lot of nerfing, which might be the fastest way to get things done, but kinda leaves us with every trait being lackluster, which isn't really much better. I think we've had a few tuning passes so far, which has tipped the balance for several traits, which is definitely a good thing. More traits should be more viable, which brings us to one of our other largest issues with Azerite Armor. It's great telling us that we should have different Azerite armor pieces for different specs. Heck, apparently, we should have even more sets for different dungeons or different boss types, but how about actually giving us the opportunity to collect those sets? Even if every trait became viable and usable in different scenarios, how are you going to collect a set to actually make use of them? I don't know if carrying around 3 different pieces for each different spec, plus extra ones just in case I want to do more AoE damage instead of single target, is really the most ideal thing in the world, but when we can't even get our hands on higher item level Azerite gear reliably, what's the point? This specific issue has become more and more prevalent as time goes on because more and more players are realizing that they're going to be stuck with 340 item level Azerite gear for quite a while. Back before Raids or Mythic Plus opened up, this wasn't as big of an issue because we were all hunting for the same stuff, item level 340 gear. While the Azerite Armor pieces from Mythic 0 dungeons were the best on offer, parts of the Azerite Armor system worked a lot better, because we could actually target the specific items we wanted with the traits we were looking for. That allowed us to create different sets, providing of course that your traits were decently varied, well balanced, and actually changed your rotation a little bit, which might have been the case for 1 or 2 classes total. For everyone else, we just wanted the best pieces of Azerite gear we could get our hands on, and even if we didn't get that ideal piece, well, at least there was a pretty decent chance to get an item level equivalent piece for the time being, because there were so many dungeons we could run each week. But as the rest of our gear started ramping up in item level after Raids and Mythic Plus released, the Azerite Armor was getting left behind. That's because Azerite Armor with an item level higher than 340 just doesn't have a reliable source. You can get some from Raids, or you can get some from your weekly Mythic Plus cache. The raid gear is definitely the more reliable source of the two, but you only have 1 or 2 chances per raid difficulty per week to get a piece of Azerite Armor for each slot. There's 5 pieces total for each armor class in Uldir. Depending on whether you're rocking cloth, leather, plate or mail gear, you're going to have 1 or 2 helms to choose from, 1 or 2 shoulder pieces and 1 or 2 chest pieces. So 1 to 2 chances per piece per difficulty. If you're running normal and heroic and you get a little lucky, you could get a 355 or 370 piece in each slot in a few weeks of raiding. Most guilds probably aren't clearing enough bosses on Mythic to get the Azerite Armor, but when we finally get around to that, there's another few chances per week. There's a few problems with this so far. The first is that if you're simply unlucky with loot drops, you can't do anything but wait for the next week and cross your fingers. That's how loot has worked for a long time, so it's usually not that big of an issue, but the Azerite Armor system is supposed to be a good chunk of our character progression. If we can't actively work towards it without having to rely on RNG, that's kind of lame, especially with the personal loot changes and everybody else probably wanting to keep their hands on the Azerite gear that they get, even if it's a duplicate, so they can start building up these extra sets. The other issue is that traits on these pieces of armor are fixed. There's no changing them, no reforging them. If those traits are good for you, fantastic. You better keep your fingers crossed that the right item drops for you next week. If those traits aren't good for you, that feels a whole lot worse. If the item level upgrade is enough to offset the bad traits, you're stuck using bad traits for the rest of the tier. If the item level doesn't offset the bad traits because your traits on your 340 piece are some of your best, and the balancing is terrible, you can't use that item despite it being 15 or even 30 item levels higher. That's not going to feel that great either, so you only have a few chances to get the higher item level Azerite Armor from raids. Some classes might not be able to even use the gear if they do get it, and with the lack of armor pieces for each armor type, you only have a handful of traits you can actually use out of what is supposed to be quite a large pool. How can we make different sets of Azerite Armor for different scenarios and different specs if we don't have any variety in the Azerite Armor available to us? That's where Mythic Plus should step in, except the only source of Azerite Armor from Mythic Plus dungeons comes from the weekly chest. We're still only getting 1 item per week out of that chest, so if you don't get your Azerite Armor piece, then it's yet again a case of keep your fingers crossed for next week. You're also pulling from the entire loot table of every dungeon in BFA, so if you're looking for 1 piece of armor in particular, or 1 trait at the very least, you're basically playing the lottery on Azerite Armor pieces. So right now you might be able to get a bit of an upgrade through normal and heroic raiding, but by the end of the tier you're only ever going to have 3 chances per week maximum to get a 385 piece of Azerite Armor, up to 2 from clearing the entirety of Mythic Uldir, and 1 from doing your weekly Mythic Plus dungeons. It's just not realistic right now to expect us to be able to collect the pieces we actually want, let alone create multiple sets for different specs or situations. But the devs team vision for the system seems to be a little confusing as well. One day they're telling us that we shouldn't feel like we need to farm specific armor sets for specific traits, because traits should be on a level playing field and an upgrade should be an upgrade, but they want traits to be meaningful and for us to swap them around for different situations and different bosses. But then they're also saying they might increase the restrictions on reforging Azerite Armor pieces because we shouldn't be reforging them as often. If we want to change our talents or use different ones in different situations, or even just play multiple specs, we should be farming up multiple sets of gear. That's just really baffling to me. If traits are all on a level playing field, where's the interesting choices or changes in gameplay? If we need multiple sets, where's the ability to actually collect them? And then we also have the forced artifact power grind to refarm traits and abilities that we had previously already unlocked. Besides feeling like you're losing progression as you get item level upgrades, this decision really makes me worry about what we'll see from the next raid tier. Right now you need an amulet level of around 18 to unlock the first ring of pretty much any piece of Azerite armor in the game, but that's going to increase with every new raid tier and every new bump up in item level. But if the traits don't change, you're not going to gain anything new, and even if a few new traits are added into the first ring for the new raid general traits, and hopefully some new class traits, after you get past that point we'll still be refarming for overwhelming power or Azerite veins. And then we'll eventually pick up our gem hides or resounding protections again. There's very little sense of meaningful progression when every item level upgrade you get takes you 2 steps back in your Azerite traits. So how can any of this even begin to be resolved? I think they would have to change at least one part of the puzzle quite significantly, because right now they have a bunch of puzzle pieces which just don't fit neatly together. They want traits to have meaningful changes to your rotation and gameplay, but they also want all traits to be on equal footing so you don't feel compelled to farm very specific pieces of armor. They don't want us to change around our traits very often, but they also apparently don't want us to collect several sets of gear because Azerite armor drops are seriously restricted. The system works against itself, which leaves players very frustrated. To me, one of the easiest options is to increase the availability of Azerite armor from Mythic Plus dungeons. I think raids should definitely still have their raid-themed general traits, which may end up being more powerful, especially while you're inside the raid, but being able to pick up some item level upgrades in these very important slots from running Mythic Plus dungeons should definitely help put out a few fires. That could be in the form of rewarding a guaranteed Azerite armor piece alongside your usual loot in the weekly Mythic Plus cache, so you know you're getting at least one piece that might be useful, but that still doesn't give us a meaningful way to target the loot we're after, which I think is quite important. So how about the Mythic Plus dungeons themselves dropping Azerite armor? It's already on the loot table for Mythic 0, just plop it back in for Mythic Plus and limit the item level in the same way the weekly chest works. You get 340 pieces up to 4 keys, 355s up until 9 keys, and then 370 pieces for keys 10 and above. That keeps everything in line with how the item level curve works in Mythic Plus already. It gives us plenty more opportunities to actually pick up some Azerite armor, we can focus on the dungeons which have the gear with traits we're looking for, and raids still end up with the highest level of gear thanks to the increase in item level for Mythic raiding. I really don't see any downfalls with this approach, except we'll be able to gather up Azerite armor much faster, so if Blizzard really are just using the system as a carrot on a stick, we'll eat the carrot faster. That might seem like a bad thing for them, but I'd say it's a damn sight better than us losing interest in the carrot altogether. Having more Azerite armor might make the system more bearable, but it doesn't really address any of the concerns with the system itself. So how can we keep the same overall system but change things around to alleviate some other issues, like the reforging and spec-specific trait problem? I think it could be a really cool change to have a ring of general traits, so instead of having one general trait in your class ring, the outermost ring is just for general traits. That could also include the raid traits and a few dungeon-specific traits which could be added in there for some extra flavour. Then instead of 3 traits from each spec on a class ring, have a spec ring which changes as you change your spec. That would mean you have access to 3 different frost traits on one piece of armor instead of just one frost trait. Then when you switch to fire, you have 3 fire traits instead of just one fire trait, which you would also have to reforge to even pick up. This also gives you way more opportunities to pick up the traits you actually want as well, which might help fix that problem at the same time. I think this system can be saved with meaningful changes, but a lot of people have called on Blizzard to just scrap a good chunk of the system and have it revert to something like the old glyph window, which isn't really a new idea. When the Azerite armor was first being tested in alpha, I remember a few posts comparing Azerite armor to glyphs, except each slot is locked behind farming artifact power and each slot is also being spread among 3 pieces of gear. That's basically what Azerite armor is. Many of the effects on traits are similar to what you might have seen on glyphs. If you take all of the traits right now, slap them into inscription as glyphs and give us back the old glyph window in place of Azerite armor, we really wouldn't see many differences from how it affects our characters and their playstyle. The key difference between those two systems is how you acquire the different powers or traits. Glyphs allowed you to collect every single trait as soon as you could find a scribe to create the appropriate glyphs for you. There's no time gating, no farming required. All you needed was a little bit of gold or the inscription profession yourself. Azerite Armor, on the other hand, requires you to farm content for the armor, farm artifact power to unlock the traits, and play various rounds of roll the dice to get any upgrades. It's a pretty big carrot on a stick to keep us logged in and actively playing, and that's why we'll probably never see the glyph system again. But let's just imagine for a second that the dev team does do away with a good chunk of it and we might end up with something similar to the glyph system. The Heart of Azeroth is our artifact, so that's where our power should come from. If every trait is handled inside of the amulet in a user interface similar to glyphs, where do we get the powers or traits from? They could still be tied to the armor pieces, so you have a pool to choose from on your amulet, but then we still run into the same issues of not being able to actively work towards better Azerite armor. If the powers aren't tied to the armor pieces, then they can revert to just being standard items with primary and secondary stats, which should also remove any incentive to restrict that gear in any way, which would fix that problem. But where do we get the traits? Inscription could be an option, just like how glyphs worked, and we all know that professions could use a little more love these days, but then we would literally have the glyph system again, and I think that no matter what happens, Blizzard will want to add some measure of time required to collect these traits, and probably some limiting factor to do with artifact power while they're at it. Well, how about earning or learning some traits as you level up your amulet? Gather up enough artifact power and you unlock a new trait to use in your amulet. That would give us a sense of progression similar to the artifacts in Legion, because as we farm up AP, we unlock new bits and bobs. The only difference here is that we're choosing a trait in the amulet instead of unlocking a new stepping stone in the artifact talent tree. That could work for spec or class specific traits quite nicely, and then you could also add in a bunch of different traits which you could get from bosses in dungeons, bosses in raids, rares out in the world, unique or rare events, and even throw in a few from PvP. They could turn the entire trait system into a new collection, which would definitely give you a bunch of variety for changing things up, and there's plenty of reasons to dip your toes into every form of content and explore new areas of the world. That might be a bit too much work at this point though. Creating new traits which are interesting enough to care about is probably getting a little difficult too, and creating enough for each type of content seems like a pretty tall ask. Another interesting way to handle these traits could be to still link them to armor drops but have the traits entirely separate from the gear by using a socketing method. Each trait can have both a size and a colour, kind of like glyphs with the major and minor deal, but throw in a colour as well to change things up, and so you can't just stack whatever you want. Each piece of Azerite armor would have various coloured sockets to match up with some traits, so you can pick and choose between a smaller pool of traits with the right colour, but you ultimately still get to choose the trait you end up using. That gives us a reason to go after different pieces of Azerite armor so we can play around with different colour combinations for all of the rings we have right now, but gives us way more flexibility when choosing the traits we actually want to use. It's kind of like the glyph system, except it maintains some of the restrictions that we have from the current Azerite armor system. The gems or orbs for each trait could be made by various profession skills, rewarded from faction reputations, looted from bosses in raids and dungeons, or anywhere else you can think of. I guess it all depends on how simple you want the system to be, because while the glyph system would remove a lot of the frustration related to the Azerite armor system right now, it also removes a lot of the gameplay along with it. I feel like we could have an amazing system if we were allowed access to more traits, the traits were more powerful themselves and changed things up a lot more, and we had a way to actively target the pieces of armor that we wanted. Personally, I think putting a lot more oomph into every trait so they feel more impactful and allowing Azerite armor to drop from Mythic Plus would go a very long way to saving the Azerite armor system right now, and then the dev team can work on more significant changes or just an entirely new system for the next expansion. I think the overarching system works pretty well and has done for every expansion we've seen it reworked. It worked well as glyphs, it worked well as artifact weapons, but Azerite armor puts too many restrictions on the system which just squashes down any fun you're going to get out of it. I'm really interested to see what changes will be made, if any, to the Azerite armor system, because right now it looks like the dev team isn't necessarily super happy about it, but also doesn't really have any answers about how to fix it, or even seems super willing to make any big changes. Patch 8.1 will be a really good test of whether or not they see the problems we're having, but I'm not really holding my breath on this one. The most I'm hoping for is for some new, maybe more interesting Azerite traits on some of the new raid gear. How do you feel about the Azerite Armor system these days? What changes would you like to see? Leave all your thoughts in the comments section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.